welcome. I'm so happy to see you today. Oh, nice. Angela, Dana, Krista, Lori, hi. Julie, so good to see all of you. I'm delighted to be doing an expert interview today with Alex Iantaffi. Alex, am I saying your name correctly?
You were saying it beautifully. Thank you.
Perfect. Alex, welcome. Um, I'm just meeting Alex for the first time, but they come highly recommended by close friends. And I'm just delighted because it feels to me like here we are in almost May of 2025, and things are a little complicated. And I really wanted to have a pretty clear and frank discussion about the challenges around being trans right now and about being a therapist for trans communities, because I'd really like to just provide a little support for the learning community. And if I understand correctly, unless we do some kind of pivot, the ultimate plan is not to keep this video behind a paywall, but instead to put it on YouTube. So if you have an issue with privacy, heads up,
Yeah.
change your name in your thumbnail or whatever. And in the course of our conversation today, I'll be watching the chat. Alex will keep their eye on the chat too a little bit, but mostly me. And if you want to send me a private message, I can surface a question or a comment anonymously as well. But send it to me so that Alex can just focus a little bit and not have to be all over the tech. So, okay, so that's our beginning sort of tech introduction. Alex, I wonder if you would start by just introducing yourself more deeply. Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are and all of that.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation. I feel honored and I really appreciate it. And I often recommend your work, Martha. So it's also such a great opportunity to like connect as well. So as Martha said, I'm Alex Iantaffi. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns in English, and then lui in Italian, which is my first language. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as an AASECT certified sex therapist and sex therapy supervisor. I'm also an AMFT approved supervisor and supervisor mentor, WPATH certified gender specialist and mental health mentor, and a somatic experience and practitioner. I think I got all my professional credentials listed there. For those of you who are interested, I have been living on Dakota Anishinaabe territories, currently known as Minnesota, since 2008. And I'm originally from Italy, but I also lived in the UK for 15 years before moving to Turtle Island in the so-called US in 2008. I have worked as a therapist, first in the UK and then in the US for the past just over 20 years now. I was an academic before becoming a therapist, actually. So I kind of done my professional journey has been a little bit upside down in that I did my PhD first, and then I did my master's in systemic psychotherapy after my PhD. So I was a scholar first and then decided to train as a psychotherapist. I've worked in a range of settings, a home therapy in the National Health Service in the UK. I've been at a school-based therapist. I've worked in a gender specialist clinic. In fact, I believe the only lasting university-based gender identity clinic that in the US. And I've also co-founded a group practice that I wrapped myself out of last year and sold to a local nonprofit, actually, so that can continue its expansion and work while I focus on other work. In terms of my positionality, I am a trans-identified, non-binary, trans-masc therapist. I'm also queer, bisexual, I'm polyamorous, I'm kinky, I'm pagan, very openly so, all those things. I'm also a parent. I use the word that often people have questions around, which is conditionally white, to try and locate my relationship to whiteness as somebody who was not being brought up in an Anglo country, and also somebody who has an accent is often read not as white. And so that's the conditional whiteness piece, and who has differences are different from those than my white Anglo colleagues. And that's just, I think that's a little bit of like overarching idea of who I am. Nowadays, I mostly do a lot of clinical supervision, especially with sex therapists, as well as still seeing clients. And I've also written a bunch of books. So if people are interested, there's a bunch of books I've published with Jessica Kingsley. I think there's about 7 out at the moment, and I've written books and chapters and things in peer-reviewed journals. I used to be the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Sexual and Relationship Therapy. All right, well, that's a really long intro, but sometimes people need to know like where I've been so that you know that I'm not just coming at this from like lived experience, which is really important. And also I have a level of professional experience that I'm hoping to bring to this conversation. And I'm really excited for this to be interactive, and rather than just me dumping a bunch of information in you, which may or may not be relevant to your practice, especially at this moment in time.
Beautiful. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Yay. My career also is a little upside down, so that's fun. Someday we'll talk more.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that.
So the first thing I want to ask you is, the title of our expert interview today is Trans and Queer Attuned Therapy. So I'm curious, what does it mean for you or for a therapist generally to be trans and queer attuned?
That's a great question. I'm going to start from the word attuned. I've been really thinking about this affirmative word, which I've definitely used in the past. I think we've seen a lot of language change over time. And the reason why I've been moving away more and more from affirmative is because I think it reinforces kind of structures of power in some ways, right? Who is affirming who, right? We don't talk about straight affirming therapy or cis affirming therapy. When we're talking about affirming somebody, is always somebody who's considered other in terms of dominant culture. And so as I've been thinking about, this more similarly as we change, right, from cultural competence to cultural humility, I've really been thinking more about this idea of attunement as a relational systemic therapist. Oh, I also forgot to mention that I'm disabled and neurodivergent. And so I can get really into a little rabbit hole and side quest. So if I go too deep into a side quest, please let me know. But I think it's important for us to think about how language and the way we talk about the work we do can inadvertently reinforce the same dominant structures of power, privilege, and oppression. And there's a whole body of work on this that is decades old. And so when I'm thinking about trans and queer attuned therapy, especially in this moment, I'm thinking about a few things. One, just at the foundation, even the fact that we need to talk about trans and queer folks as a separate topic, I think it tells us a lot about who has been centered in the field of mental health, right? In an ideal world, we shouldn't have to specifically talk about trans and queer people or folks of the global majority or BIPOC folks, depending on what language you're using. And again, that's another example of how we can use language to reinforce or challenge ideas of power and privilege in our dominant culture. But I think the fact that we need to have this kind of topics almost be considered like a niche in air quote, I think it tells me a lot about who has been centered historically in our field. And so I think for me, the first step is really acknowledging that. And not assuming that everybody who comes through our door is cis and or straight and or mononormative, right, as well. So that's one piece. And I think that often there is that assumption, right? Even when I work with supervisees, they're like, I don't want to work with cis people. And I'm like, that is totally your prerogative. Of a lot of trans supervisees. I was like, and also, a lot of people, like sometimes they come to you, they might not stay cis forever. They might also appear cis and straight, but there might be a reason why they might choose, right, a trans therapist or a queer therapist. And in my experience, often there is, honestly. And so it's more like you get to set whatever boundaries you want, but really maintain some openness to the idea that as humans, we don't fall into this rigid, neat categories, right? Life is not just a series of dichotomous binaries. In fact, I co-wrote a whole book that's called Life Isn't Binary. And so even just the idea of like who gets what, where is that line, right? Of who's trans and then who's non-binary and then who's cisgender, right? Those are all artificial lines in some ways, not to say that there aren't specific experiences, especially experiences of oppression that are different for cis folks and trans folks and non-binary folks, but also that we need to be able to have the much more nuanced conversations, I think, that we have when it comes to gender and sexuality, if that makes sense. Similarly with sexuality, right? Where is the line? As somebody who's also done a lot of public health research, I know that, for example, identity doesn't always line up with behavior, right? There's a reason why public health started using men who have sex with men and women who have sex with women as terminology, right? And so I think for me, that first piece around trans and queer attuned therapy is like, let's not make assumptions about people, gender identity, expression, gender roles in their relationships. If you work with couple, polycules, other relational systems, families. And as part of that not making assumption, we can also not neatly separate gender and sexuality from how we're racialized, our class location, our level of education, our indigeneity or not, our citizenship status, right? All of those things are our disability status, our neurodivergent status, all those things are intimately interconnected to each other. And I think often because the way we kind of produce knowledge and pass knowledge along is so influenced by coloniality and white supremacy, we like to put things in tidy little boxes. Right? This is how you do therapy with trans and queer folks. This is how you do therapy, like, right, with people of the global majority. This is how you do therapy with polyamorous people. And I think it's much more complex than that, honestly. And so, and maybe this is a kind of a cheating answer, I don't know, but I'm like, it's complicated, right? Because in an ideal world, we're really just attuned to people's genders and sexualities. And we understand that they're actually really complex and multifaceted and almost, we cannot really separate ourselves into all these pieces, right? And so I would say that that's the first thing to think about, which can feel very overwhelming sometimes if we're not used to thinking in this intersectional way that's kind of critical towards systems of power, privilege, and oppression. And I think it can be overwhelming and also simple in many ways, right? Because in a way, what it means, it's centering the relationship and the relationality piece. And rather than viewing everything through the lenses of our identities and experience. And so I think for me to be able to be culturally attuned, whether it's with trans and queer folks, disabled folks, folks of the global majority who share different social locations than mine, to be attuned to my clients also means to expose myself to identities and experiences that are different from my own. So it's also about which books do I read in my free time, and not just therapy books, but also like fiction books and so on, right? What shows do I watch? Who do I talk to? What does my friendship group looks like? Where do I live in community? And how do I build community with others? And so it's really multifaceted, and it's really more about, and there's more integration, I think, for me around professional and personal lives, not in a messy way. I love boundaries, believe me, especially professionally. And I also think we need to challenge some of the ways in which we have created this idea of professionalism as completely separate from our personal lives, if that makes sense, to a point where often there is almost like a chasm of dissonance, I would say, between kind of how we are showing up professionally and how we're showing up in our day-to-day so-called non-professional life, whatever that means, if that makes sense. I don't know. That was a really long, convoluted answer, which maybe didn't give people any ideas at all, but that's where I'm at the moment.
What I took, I mean, there was a lot there, and we could go through it clearly with in a lot of depth. But the main thing that really stands out for me is how many assumptions we make about other people based on our own identity and way of seeing the world.
Mhm.
And when we start thinking about, I mean, as therapists, we know something about how complex the formation of meaning is. And so that can help us to begin to understand that there are an exquisitely diverse range of perspectives, and any one perspective is really only just that.
Yeah.
And so when we start making assumptions, we're making them, an assumption is based on something. It's based on a belief position. And then if that's where we're operating from, we're missing all the nuance, so much nuance and so much individuality. And I often say that the more somebody looks like me, the more careful I am about making assumptions about them. It's very easy to assume that somebody who looks like me, talks like me, acts like me, lives where I live, and has relationships like I have, has a lot in common with me. And then I can make a bunch of really implicit assumptions about what's important to them, how they relate to the change process, how they view their gender roles, how they, all the things. And so those are, I feel like those are the ones I'm really careful with. The more different
Absolutely.
we appear, the more I am, clearly it's reinforced to me that we are different.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's interesting that a lot of people get more and more nervous the more different we are.
Mhm.
And I get more and more careful the more same we are. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm thinking a lot about that nuance. And for a long time, I've talked about the difference between identity and behavior and labels. It's just so super complicated. What a great start. We're off to a good start, Alex.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, and I would just add that I so relate to everything you said, Martha, and also who do we center and who do we consider as other, right? That's something that whenever our facilitators are, for example, I always invite people to reflect on who is the other for us, right? Who is our center and who is the other? Who is the baseline, right? And even I often joke or I say tongue in cheek, but I do mean it, that I love working with cis white straight couples because so much of it is gender work. And a lot of it is gender work, especially in sex therapy, like all the expectations around masculinity, all the expectations around femininity, all the ways in which our sexuality is constructed through this lens of masculinity and femininity is so much gender work, to do couples work, to do work with polycules, to do sex therapy work with cis straight folks. There is just so much to unpack there. Not to say that there isn't so much to unpack there with trans and queer folks, because believe me, there is. But often cis straight folks haven't had as many opportunities or invitations to deconstruct some of those ideas, honestly. And those are very relevant, whether we're working with, um, uh, general functioning issues like erectile functioning issues or genital pain or infidelity or differences in desire. And yet our field is so caught up in binary, and so much of the research is very binary and very much based on like cisgender identities and also on younger people, cisgender identities and norms, that it can be very challenging to know what to do from a different lens, if that makes sense. And so I love what you said of like, oh, the more somebody looks or seems like similar to me, the more careful I am, because, it's that piece of differentiation, which I always refer folks to you. Actually, I was like, and like, look at all this good resources on Martha's website on differentiation, right? there are some things we have in common in terms of our human experience, and also we are individuals. And so how do we dance between our kind of individual identities and experiences and also our collective identities and experiences as humans as well. And that is pretty delicate dance, I think, especially as a therapist.
Yeah, for sure. So are there, I mean, I think we just may have covered this considerably, but in addition to what we have already talked about, are there particular missteps that therapists often make with queer and or trans clients that you'd like to highlight?
Absolutely. Well, one of the there are so many. Where do I even start? I think one of them sometimes is kind of really to assume who is in the room um, and what they might be struggling with because of the identities that they carry, right? And what do I mean by that? So, for example, if you're working with like a couple, maybe it's a mononormative couple, like a cis opposite gender mononormative couple, and one person comes out of as trans or non-binary, there might be a lot of assumptions about how that is going to be like a stressor in the relationship, or that there might be a sense of loss, or that the cis partner might struggle with this, right? And sometimes that is true, and sometimes it's not. And interestingly, the centering can go in a lot of different directions. Sometimes the trans identity is centered to the point that the cis partner might feel really unheard or unseen, or sometimes vice versa. The cis identity can be so centered that then the trans partner feels really unseen, for example. And so, especially when we're working with couples or polycules or family systems, how do we not just get caught up into just one part of the system, but how do we look at the whole relational dynamic and not make assumptions through our own lenses, right? Because often I've worked, especially with trans feminine folks, where it almost felt like a foregone conclusion that their marriage would just break down and they would lose their spouse regardless, right? And that the therapists who have actually kind of perpetuated this mythology rather than like, there are a lot of different ways that this can go. And separation or divorce is not the foregone conclusion when somebody comes out, right? So one piece is just kind of being careful not to just kind of predict what you think somebody needs or what's going to happen just because of popular discourse, just because of maybe our own identities and experiences and how we might approach that kind of situation. And then in other pitfalls that I see sometimes, it's kind of wanting to show, especially if somebody is not trans and or queer, what a good ally somebody is. So for example, I had a very well-meaning provider, a primary care provider, it was a gender-affirming care provider who, and I don't mind sharing this personal example at all, that when I went for one of my regular pap smear, made a lot of assumptions about how I would feel about my genitals as a trans person. And that was really off-putting because also I'm like, okay, I know you got like 15 minutes. I'm not going to break down. I was just like, yeah, okay, I'm good. Like, this is what I need. But there was so much care in air quotes, right? And I know this is stressful and I know this can cause dysphoria. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of assumptions. We met like twice because you're a new primary care provider. And you seem to assume a lot about how I would feel about my body and about my genitals. So again, like really thinking about what lens are we applying, right? Or at somebody, a supervisor I worked with was like, I just want a consult because there is this mom who's just concerned about the health issues with binding. And, I just want to give her some good information so I can like put her mind at rest because there are no health issues with binding. And I was like, well, actually, there are health issues with binding your chest. And seems like, when the person told me a little bit more about the case, I was like, it seems like mama's got really good reason to worry about their teenagers' kind of practices around binding for too many hours. And here are some resources, right? And so really watch that our desire to center identities that are minoritized doesn't backfire, if that makes sense, right? And it was super well-meaning, and I completely appreciate and send a lot of clients the way of this person who's now fully licensed and certified and experienced. But all of us can fall into those pitfalls if it makes sense. And so there are things like that seems very obvious, right? Don't misgender people. Don't say things like preferred name or preferred pronouns is a little more complicated. But, and I'll say why if people are curious about that. There are things that are really obvious. Don't say things that are transphobic or queerphobic. But then there is this other piece where we need to watch that if we want to be, when we want to be affirming in air quotes, again, because we have different identities and experiences, we might be ignoring things that actually need to be talked about in the therapy room, if that makes sense. And sometimes those conversations can also be complex and reach as well. So that's just a couple of things.
Yeah, I love that story from your own healthcare experience. I hate when people tell me how I think and feel.
Yes.
Gee, I wonder why anybody would think that anybody would enjoy that. It seems like a universally unpleasant experience to me, but yeah.
Exactly. And when we pause to think about it, we're like, oh yeah, I wouldn't like if people made assumptions about who I am just based on a few things, right? And similarly, and I do see Peter's comment in the chat of thoughts on the term preferred pronouns. Would that actually, that's a really great example of something where people are looking for rules, right? How do I do this? Some people like it when folks share pronouns, and people don't. And as somebody who does use multiple pronouns, I do have a preference. For example, not everybody is going to just use one pronouns and stick with it all the time. Like my preference is for they, them in English, but he, him is okay as well. And in some very limited contexts with them, when I'm out and about, with some of my colleagues or like gay men, she, her might even be appropriate. I remember when I started working in a school public health department a few years back, and one of my colleagues pulled me aside and was like, listen, I just say she to all the other gay men here, and I often use females' name, but you are like trans and I don't want to upset you. So how do I approach this? And I was like, just treat me like all the other dudes. And that worked great. And he was also the first person that if we went out socializing at a bar would like correct people if they got my pronouns wrong or misgendered me, right? And so again, like for even pronouns can be contextual. In my first language, there isn't really a gender neutral pronoun in Italian. Lots of Romance languages have this issue. And there are cultural changes that are happening around ending of adjectives and words to degender them or challenge the gender binary, but there isn't like a neutral pronoun per se. So I have a different preference than I have in English. And even in English, that preference changes, right? And so that I think speaks to the complexity of our experiences. And it's not just me, there's a lot of other trans folks who feel this way. Similarly with words, right? Some people, the word transsexual, for example, is doing a comeback. And I know some older folks were like, my identity really, not my own, but some of my colleagues were like, I do identify as transsexual, and I feel that if I say this out loud, some of the younger trans folks might see me as a trans medicalist, so somebody who only see trans folks as legitimate if they've gone through certain medical transition steps and body modification changes, right? And so again, language, and now there are people who are pushing back and going, we should all be able to use whatever identity label feels most fitting, right? And also there's the piece where our identity labels change contextually, right? If we're thinking about this idea of positioning theory from Harris, like challenge to the singularity of self, right? If our identity is relational, inherently This is like the 1-minute summary of a much more complex theory. But basically this idea that we're constantly inviting each other into certain positions and relationalities. For example, I'm invited to show up as an expert, in air quotes, in this conversation, whatever that means. I guess somebody who has experience in this field, as well as in my personal life, right? And you are being invited as listeners and learners, right? And we're all behaving according to those rules. It's kind of implicit, right? And we're constantly inviting and are being invited in certain roles and position. And so that means that our self is not as singular and monolithic as we might think. And so if that is true, that piece about preferred pronouns and yes, the original form actually had no pronouns that preferred gender, right? And even that, if people have multiple genders that they identify with, or if people are plural in some way or assistive, right, they might have a different relationship to gender than folks who are mostly singlet. And so our identities are so complex, and we approach it as we could, put it on a little checklist, do those things, and now magically your clinic or practice is affirming and you get a little sticker, and the reality is that it's much more complex than that. There's going to be ruptures, there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be things we do that are okay with some clients, and then other clients are like, that was totally not okay, or I hate this language, right? And so how do we create enough safety, I guess, within ourselves in the context where we work, where all of those things can be held with open hands, and so rather than latched on as the truth or the right way of doing things, if that makes sense, right? Because when we hold things with open hands, we can pick them up, we can look at them, we can put them down. But if we're holding on to them so tight, then we get tired, we might drop them, we might even throw them away because we get frustrated, right? And I think similarly with a lot of ideas about how we should practice with different populations, there is a risk that we get kind of overly committed to doing things in a certain way. And the reality is that as humans, we're constantly growing and evolving in relationship to each other too. Like there's language that, for example, I have used in the past and I don't use anymore. I have used words like biological sex. I have used words like natal sex. I have used words like male-bodied and female-bodied. I don't use those words anymore because I have alternatives and I know better, and I know how those words reinforce certain things. And also those words were really common in research, especially to talk about certain identities and behaviors. And so also, how do we hold ourselves with gentleness when we learn that there are different ways of looking at things and different words that we can use and different practices that we can adopt without like holding on to the old practices or without overly judging ourselves as well, or each other too, right? I don't know if that makes sense or if I went into too long of a side quest, but that's what I've got on that for now.
You're fabulous. This is a great segue to one of the things I wanted to ask you and to make sure we covered today. How do you recommend therapists address it when they make a mistake or unintentionally hurt somebody? Their client says, that didn't feel good to me or something.
That is a great question. Always center the impact over your intention, right? When I facilitate learning, for example, as a main facilitator, one of the group agreements I have is let's imagine best intention while remaining accountable for our impact, right? So of course, as therapists, we don't want to harm our clients and we don't want to have ruptures, but those are going to happen because the therapeutic relationship is a relationship. And what we know about relationship is that rapture is unavoidable. At some point, we're going to be misattuned, right? Even the most devoted gestational parent, caregiver is going to misattune to their baby, let alone like as adults, right? There are so many reasons of why. And so I think that first of all, not taking it personally. And I always start with gratitude when a client tells me that I've said something that's been hurtful, didn't work for them in some way, shape, or form. And so I always start with like, thank you so much. I know it's not easy to share those moments, and I'm so grateful, right, that you've told me so that now we can address it. And then really staying focused on the impact of what has happened, right? Really trying to understand what is it that doesn't work for the client. And then rather than go in a state of collapse, right? Because we can also just go into that somatic state of collapse and being overly apologetic. Because sometimes also the misattunement can be due to trauma and like misinterpreting also things we say, right? Sometimes it's straight up, we said something unfortunate. Absolutely. And sometimes the client has heard something unfortunate through their lenses, right? And hopefully there's enough therapeutic joining where we can unpack it in those moments, right? So just because I'm validating the client doesn't mean that I'm like wholesale, like, yeah, like, and I can give an example of that. Once in group, I found out that an individual that somebody really felt that was saying something about non-binary experiences being better than like more binary experiences for trans folks. And we really unpacked that. And I was like, oh, I'm really, first of all, I'm really sorry. I'm so glad you've told me this, right? Always start from gratitude. This is a learning opportunity. This is a gift that the client is giving you. So this is a gift the client is giving me by letting me know this. And, you know, I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry. And also want to understand better what is it that I said that felt this way, right? And then we were able to unpack it. And actually, a few sessions later, the client was like, actually, I don't think you said what I thought you said at all. I think I got activated and triggered by XYZ, right? But we can't get to that point if we don't start from gratitude. This is a gift, not taking it personally, even if we feel there's a lot of dissonance between what the client has received and what we were trying to do or say, right? Because if the client doesn't feel validated and heard and cared for in some ways, right? That care that they're hurt, then we can't get anywhere with the repair. And the other thing that I do is I say right from the get-go, when I do my little spiel, when I start working with new clients, you know, there are going to be moments of misattunements. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. And you're probably going to be mad at me at some point. And because that's just being human. And so how am I going to know if that happens? Especially because I work in the Midwest, very important conversation to have because direct communication, not culturally really common. Let's put it that way in Minnesota. And so it's really important to have that conversation at the beginning. What am I going to notice? What are our agreements? How are we going to repair? And I think that saying from the get-go, like this might happen, it can be really helpful. Or like, you know, my own therapist, I was the first person that they did a letter for 12 years ago, whenever it was, for top surgery. And she was like, oh, I know you're an expert at this, so can you review the letter? And I was like, absolutely. And I was like, oh, this is not necessary. Insurance doesn't need to know this. Yep, they don't need this. And she was like, great, thank you. Now she's done a lot of letters and she's worked with a lot of trans clients, but she was really honest. Like, I haven't worked with trans clients. I'm willing to do this letter for you. I've never done one. Do you want to go to somebody else? And I was like, not really, because why would I go and start from scratch with somebody who doesn't even know me just because of one letter? We can figure it out together, right? Again, that therapeutic relationship. But if she had centered herself as an expert or like, I've got this, or pretended to know more than she did, I don't think that that experience would have gone as smoothly, if that makes sense. I see there's also a bunch of things in the chat, but so I'll pause on that.
We have so much to cover. There are several questions that I'm going to kind of lump together here into resources for further learning about vocabulary and keeping up with language trends, and how would somebody actually educate themselves without reading like a massive tome. First of all, I just have to point to our humongous resource list, which has really a lot. And then what you got, Alex?
Absolutely. Well, I have a lot of things. First of all, it's like there's not any one resource I can point you to. And that goes hand in hand with what I was saying, right? Just because there is a resource, like trans bodies, trans selves, I think, what is, I'm looking at my shelves right now. Yes, I think it's trans bodies, trans selves, for example. It's a great resource, especially the newer edition as well. But it's just one lens, right? So my recommendation is actually to read a broad range of resources. Also, there are words that by and large are not used by most of the community that some people will still use. And it doesn't make them right or wrong. That's just, you will still hear trans folks talk about male-bodied and female-bodied. So I would say take the time for you to do your own gender work and decide what words you want to use that are consistent with your values. And I hate recommending my own work, but How to Understand Your Gender, if you haven't done any of that, it's literally what Meg-John Barker wrote it for. It's very much written for a general audience. It is not written for trans people. It's mostly been written for cis people, honestly, even though some trans folks have found it helpful in their journey. Another resource specifically, I can put all of this in the chat, and I can also send you a further reading list as well if people want it. I've got a handout of resources and like learning more about gender kind of handout that I can send you, Martha, and you are absolutely welcome to share it with everybody else. So I would say don't rely just on one resource and really think about what are my values and what do I want to convey with language and what language do I want to use. And then if your clients use different language, it's okay to honor it. And if they notice, oh, you're using different language than I use, you can say, absolutely, this is why I use the language I use. I'm really curious about why it feels important for you to use the language you use, right? It becomes a conversation, if that makes sense. And so learn from a broad range of sources. And that goes for me as well. Don't ever just be like, this is my go-to person or this is my go-to source. Read multiple sources. There's also Bino Handbook, Decolonizing Gender, which was really helpful. And same with parents to discuss and sexuality with their trans kid. Again, there are so many more resources than there were even 5 or 10 years ago. Jessica Kingsley has got an old gender diversity list, including books for kids of all ages, pretty much. They have books that start from to be able to talk about gender and sexuality to very young kids, all the way to teenagers. There are resources like the Gender Wheel by Maya Gonzalez. There's Corey Silverberg's books, from the very young, What Makes a Baby, to Sex is a Funny Word, to sex. And then as kids get older, Heather Corina's book, SCX, there are so many good resources in terms of young people and sexuality, many by AASECT members as well. Again, beautiful. Thank you, Christy. I can send some resources around that. And I think that,
send us all your resources and
absolutely.
We'll put them on the replay page along with this as well.
Yeah.
Awesome.
But I think a lot of it is for you to really look at like, if I say natal gender, what does that mean? Am I thinking about the gender that gets assigned to somebody on the basis of their visible markers when they're a baby? Or do I have like a biological determinist idea of gender? right? Do I understand that people can have different chromosomal makeup that is not always visible? And do I think that gender is just located in primary or secondary sexual characteristics? Do I think that gender is separate from sex? There's been a lot of challenging of the separation of sex and gender, for example, by trans scholars like Jules Jill Peterson and um, Florence Ashley and some other brilliant trans scholars are coming up all the time. It's so exciting to see so many trans academics in the field. And so I would say also keep reading. It's not like I've learned something and now I stay static, right? It's like there's a reason why my language has changed. It's because we have changed as a community. We've challenged each other, to think about things differently. If you haven't had the opportunity, for example, to watch the documentary Framing Agnes, I would really recommend it for that historical view of especially trans feminine, but not exclusively trans folks' experiences over time from like a more historical perspective, also really beautifully critical perspective. And Jules Jill Peterson is one of the scholars interviewed in that documentary. So if you subscribe to Nebula, there is a play called The Prince by, I can't remember the name of the brilliant trans woman who wrote it, which is really good and really looks at gender in very interesting ways. So also don't just rely on academic resources. Watch the art and listen to the music and watch the plays that trans and non-binary and genderqueer and queer folks put out in the world, right? Because that really gives you a much more, much richer and much more diverse lens through which to look at your clients as well, right? So yes, I'm happy to share some of those things. And yes, I will pop both Framing Agnes and The Prince in the chat as well. And if you haven't had a chance also to look at, I think it's Disclosure, the name of the documentary on Netflix about representation, that's another really great one. There's so many. Like you can also, there's Alok's comedy special called Biology. She's very informative actually on YouTube. So I'll put all of those in the chat. But basically the encouragement is for you to look at a broad range of sources and really engage critically and also spend time reflecting on what your values are and what you want to convey with the language you use with your clients, and not only with your clients, in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Everybody always gets very nervous that they're going to miss out on some resources. I promise you, we will have all the resources for you.
Yes.
I'm a pretty reliable resourcer. So there's a question that was asked to me in the chat about an aspect of the doing of the therapy, and I want to surface that, but I really want to make sure that we have time to talk about the current situation that we're in right now, because one of the reasons that I contacted you in the first place was because I had one too many conversations with somebody who said, wait, what? Why is your life particularly stressful right now? Why do you think therapists need to hear about trans experience right now? What the heck? Oh, why? Aren't we all in this together or something? I don't know. I hit my limit and called you. So I do want to make sure that nobody leaves here not having a pretty clear idea of what's going on for trans people in 2025. Probably everywhere, but especially in the United States. With apologies to the person who sent me the private message, I will do my best to get to it all, but let's start with this aspect before we run out of time.
Yeah, I forget that this conversation could be 3 hours, especially because I'm a talker. So sorry about that. I think also I caught all the links to the documentaries I mentioned and popped them in the chat already. I try to be fast on those. Oh, where do I even start? Yes, we are all in this together, and we're also in this together in different ways. And if Yes, I've also written a whole entire book about gender trauma, which is very relevant, I think, actually, in this moment in time. I will actually put that link to in the chat. And so I agree. We are all in this together, and some of us are impacted in specific ways. So here's the link to just generally where my books are. And then here's a link specifically to gender trauma, where I talk about how the gender binary is also part of the ongoing colonial project and part of white supremacy. And I think we're seeing, and eugenics and ableism, and I think we're seeing this really blown out in this political moment, but we don't always have all the tools to unpack what's happening, and that is purposeful. So it is not an accident that while there is this attack on trans rights, we're also seeing things like this regime, because I don't even want to honor it, we're calling it a government or an administration. It is not an accident that we're seeing this rise of transphobia at the same time as we're having this rise of eugenics when it comes to disability, and also at the same time as we're seeing this regime having conversation about encouraging women to have more babies, right? Which is, and also it is not that we are becoming like Nazi Germany, it's Nazi Germany took a leaf from here, and how the so-called United States had managed to pretty much be engaged in this ongoing genocide of indigenous folks, right? And so we can't separate any of those things neatly from one another. And so I think that some folks who haven't been directly impacted by the legacy, I mean, we've all been impacted, but some folks who haven't really unpacked how they might have been impacted by this legacy of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, do feel particularly impacted in this moment. You know, I hear sometimes people say, this is the worst timeline. I was like, I feel like Indigenous folks and some also Black folks have something to say about that, just saying. You know, and they're saying this out loud. It's not like, you know, and trans folks have something to say about this. It's not the first time, right, we've been targeted. And we have been targeted straight from the beginning of the ongoing colonial project, right? There's a reason why there's still the systemic violence that mostly impact Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folks, right? Trans and queer folks are often like a challenge to more restrictive, more fascist regimes that really look at controlling bodies, controlling reproduction, because ultimately, there's so many things to say about this, so many more that we have time for. But all of that to say, I think I'll keep it simple, that some of us have been targeted for a very long time, but the more privilege we have because of proximity to whiteness or citizenship or ability, we might not have been aware of this constant current. And now we're seeing this current like a wave, right, come onto the surface. And so it might feel really impactful in this moment, and it is, right? For example, if I, as a trans person, I need to think about where is it safe for me to travel to? But I can't just think where is it safe for me to travel to as a trans person. I also have to think about it as a disabled person. Because, okay, as a trans person, okay, maybe I go to this conference and I'm okay. But what happens if I go to this conference in Florida, in Missouri, in Texas, and then I have a medical emergency and I need to go to the ER? It's not uncommon as somebody who's aging with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And then what is going to happen? I mean, it's hard enough in a trans refuge state like Minnesota. What is going to happen if the care team that I'm dealing with, you know, looks at my body mind as more disposable than somebody else? And so that is what a lot of us trans folks are dealing with, for example. And then those of us who are therapists, not only we're constantly waking up to what is the What is today's news of what to date, there have been, I think the last time I looked a couple of weeks ago, it was over 850 anti-trans bills being introduced across states in the United States. So that's almost like 1,000, and it's not even the end of April, right? And so it's already, you have the allostatic load, right? That exhaustion. And then you go and you see your trans clients and your trans supervisees, and then you're disabled. And it's like, what wave of eugenics is happening today? And then you go and work with your disabled clients and disabled supervisees. And then now there's going to be an autism registry. It's not a registry, but we're going to gather this information and pull it together. It sounds an awful lot like a registry, right? And it's not like eugenics hasn't always existed, but now it's seen as more acceptable on a broader scale, right? And there is an active propaganda campaign to make it acceptable. And so ultimately, some of us are going to be seen as more disposable first, but we're all seen as disposable under capitalism ultimately, because we are just kind of cogs in a wheel to make money to a very small percentage of people, right? We're commodities at the end of the day. If we were not commodities, it wouldn't be so hard to get universal health care, for example, in this country. This should be pretty straightforward. Oh, we're a really wealthy country. No child should go hungry. No child should lack education. And nobody should not be covered for health care or go bankrupt because they had a heart attack in between jobs when they didn't have healthcare coverage, right? Doesn't seem very complicated. And yet, those things become complicated because there's been such propaganda in the United States around the land of the free and the American dream. It's like the propaganda and propaganda are so deeply baked in the fabric and the foundation of this country that, now we're just seeing the fruit of the tree, of the seed that were already planted. I don't know. That is maybe a very convoluted answer to your question, but that is what I got.
I thought that was so coherent, actually.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, really coherent. And I'm thinking about how many of us are working with queer and trans clients. Some of us are queer or trans ourselves, others not. And I'm really interested in helping therapists feel supported. It can feel like it's a hopeless time. How can I actually help? Am I really helping? It's such an undoable help. And I just wonder what you would like to say about that.
Absolutely. It's a depressing time. Don't get me wrong. I've just had this conversation with two supervisees before this today um, on the phone because my internet decided not to work. Um, It is impossible if we do this alone. One of my close friends, an elder, a Sami elder, Donald Engstrom Rees, taught me something that's really important, which is, we cannot find balance within ourselves. Balance is found in community, right? And so part of the lies of ragged individualism is that we feel like, oh my God, there's so much going on. How can I show up, right? Rather than how can we show up? Right. And so, first of all, we cannot do this work alone, 100%. It's a tough time. So, more than ever, we need to feel that we have community around us and support. And also, we cannot go in, I think, from a saviorist standpoint, right? I'll sweep in with the kind of white knighting this moment. This is not what the moment requires of us, I don't think. But I think what we can do is being very grounded in the awareness that there have always been healers. In every culture all across the globe, there's always healers. And therapists are just one manifestation of what a healer looks like in 2025 in so-called United States, right? And so, first of all, how can we lean on the broader ancestral web of healing lineage? And then how can we make sure that we have enough community around us that we feel like we're all working on slightly different aspects of the work, but we're also working together. And how can we approach this, which I think it's where a lot of mental health education doesn't do a very good job. It's like there are lots of issues that are systemic. We can't fix them in therapy. But what we can do is show up to a therapeutic relationship where we can help people feel less alone and less isolated, right? And especially as sex therapy, we know that how much of sex therapy is helping people not feel like a freak, for example, right? In air quotes, right? How many people come to us like so fearful of telling us what they're really experiencing or what they really want, right? And how much of that is just like normalizing the breath and expansiveness of human sexuality and what sex means and what gender means. And I don't think this moment is any different. It's like that relational piece, if that makes sense. And so just really remembering we're not doing this alone, really remembering that there is also a web of support that goes outside of the therapy room. Like I always like to see myself as one piece of the web of care and support that my clients deserve. And I talk about it. Like even when I have clients who are like, you're the only person I trust. I'm like, and I'm so glad that you now have a felt sense of what trust feels like for you and how can we, now that you have this compass internally, how can we use it so you can find other trustworthy people in your life? Because you can't like, right? We don't want to make our clients dependent on us either. There is the web of care there that's available to our clients, but also that's available to us. I'm talking a lot to my supervisees and to myself, honestly, on making sure we're not overextending beyond our capacity, because this is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. And so if we overextend, we're going to get exhausted. And so how do we really pay attention to what matters? How do we not exhaust ourselves and each other? Right? I've had to set a boundary with a family member recently. I'm like, please stop sending me things about Trump. I actually am very intentional how I consume my news media, and I have a lot of boundaries around it for my own mental health so that I can show up for my clients. So I am informed, but there are a lot of boundaries around where I get my information from, when I get my information from, and how. Because that and that's a lot of work that I also do with supervisees and with clients, right? How do we set internal and external boundaries in this moment? Because those boundaries help us be in relationship with each other, right? Not to keep each other out or compartmentalize, but to have healthier relationship with ourselves internally as well as with each other and with the world. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I got. Also, it's a lot. Like, it's okay to be like, yeah, this sucks and it's fucked up and it's a lot and I'm tired. Like, I think we're all tired. And it goes a long way sometimes to validate and be like, oh my God, I know, right? I saw that. What do we do now? I don't know, but here we are and we're not alone, right? Um, that's what I got on that one for now.
That's beautiful. I so agree with you. And what you said is comforting and resonates a lot. We are not alone. And in the moments when we feel alone, we could reach out and become less alone. Uh,
Yes.
and in possibly in ways that are uncomfortable or vulnerable or feel risky, or maybe just really small ways that are available and we just haven't thought about it. I also really appreciate you highlighting that this level of oppression and just fucked upness, it's not new. Um, and just because I, as a middle class white person living in Madison, Wisconsin, have not experienced this level of fucked up, does not mean that my friends have not. And
Oh, mhm.
so but that also means that there are people who know how to navigate this.
Exactly.
And that's very, very comforting to me. There are people have come through a hell of a lot, and we're not done, and we're not going to be done. And it's not like this is a thing we get through and then the sun comes out and everything is great because everything was great before. It was not. I just wasn't in the center of it.
Exactly. There's a reason why, and I know I am flexible with time if you are, but I think you said something really important, Martha, and I want to make sure that it's heard, which is like there are people with this knowledge. And so a lot of what I know and I write about too is I learned from Black scholar and Indigenous scholars and Latinx scholars and disabled scholars, right? Folks at the margin of dominant culture have always had to figure this out. And so, and that is important even when we work with clients to understand, are they isolated as their positionality meant that they don't have this connection? Because the people that I see really struggling with this the most at the moment are the people who have not been plugged into the broader web of knowledge and community organizing. There's a whole network of people who have been thinking about alternative economic systems, who have been thinking about dismantling some of those systems for a long time, right? Folks like Miriam Kaba who talk about like hope as a discipline. Let me put that name in the chat so that we don't lose it. But you know, this idea of abolitionism, which often people approach as new, it's not at all new. And there's a reason why I think we've seen a resurgence of that. Um, it's really because I think that that is the lens we need at the moment. We really need to rethink critically about all those systems. And I know that there are also very specific questions about like how to work with clients where there is especially a minor who's coming out and family is not supportive. That could be like a whole 3-hour conversation, which I would be happy to have at some point. And again, I can send some resources because that is always a tricky situation to navigate and even trickier now. But the last thing I would say is just like also pay attention to where your source of information's come from. I've seen even therapists give credence, I think it's how it's pronounced, sorry, give credence to theories like rapid onset gender dysphoria, which has been completely debunked, is based on poor research. As a researcher, like just look at the methodology of some of the studies, right? Some of the studies that get quoted and reported, including the CAS review, are deeply methodologically flawed. You know, as an academic, it's easier for me to look at this and be like, here are all the flaws of the methodology. But as therapists as well, we need to know what are the reputable sources of information so that I can adequately support clients and their families when they bring things like, what about this CAS review? Or what about this rapid onset gender dysphoria? And I can be like, hey, here's a statement from all this reputable professional association saying why rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a thing. Hey, here's a really good in-depth look at the CAS review and why this is not a reputable source of information, right? So we need to, and again, I can pass those links to Martha and team and Christy as well to pass on to you. Like we need to know and sift through and discern for ourselves what are reputable sources of information so we don't get caught into like false information and flawed methodological studies that we're going to see thrown around more and more to justify what's going on.
Thank you. For the people in the chat who have a clinical slanted question, what I'd like to invite you to do is bring those to the case discussion board because we've got you here in my course. You know, there's one question that is essentially about trauma. There's one question that's about kids and families. And my teaching assistants have all different
Great.
of expertise, and we've got you covered. So bring your questions, but maybe not right this minute because we're running out of time. Do you have 5 more minutes, Alex? Please feel free.
I do.
Okay. So people, interestingly, have had a lot of questions about language. And so I wonder if you could give us some examples of language that you use that's not outdated. I'm taking this question out of the chat, and I just can tell from the number of questions that were about language that this will come as a relief to everybody. So lay it on us.
Sure. Oh my God. Also, my first degree is in linguistics, and my little ADHD brain just exploded because I was like, I need 2 hours to put this question, but I'm trying to give you the 2 minutes answer. So, I have stopped distinguishing sex and gender. So I say things like assigned gender at birth now. Just really to acknowledge like the complexity, and also because the more we distinguish between sex and gender, the more people get caught up in like sex is binary and gender is a social construct. Way more complicated than that. Even the fact that we gender chromosome is a choice that humans have made, and there's more to say about that. But I've written it down so people can also read about it. So just common words that I use are assign gender at birth if I need to, transmasculine, transfeminine, if I need to use a encompassing umbrella word, and then I honor what people call themselves, if that makes sense. Honoring what people call themselves, honoring pronouns. Also, if you are not aware that now the ICD-11 talks about gender incongruence and not gender dysphoria, you might want to make yourselves familiar with that. Also, if you're not familiar with the Centers of Care version 8, you might want to make yourselves familiar with that. Not that they always have the best language, but they are the standards to which we're working at the moment, and it's the language that insurance understands. And as well, and then saying things like using words like testosterone dominant bodies versus estrogen dominant bodies, for example, rather, right? Because sometimes I do need to talk about some of those differences. I used to be an HIV researcher as well. So sometimes I even had to talk about which genitals people have and which genitals they put in each other in terms of HIV research, literally. So it's like, I understand that sometimes we've got to talk about things, but even using words like genitals, rather than like specific, like, and also there is a piece about an over-coupling in somatic experiencing terms that happens, I think, between certain characteristics in gender. And so really noticing all the places where I might be inadvertently reinforcing gender norms and cisgenderism. And so like in the day-to-day, I think that using words that are more inclusive, like the examples I've given, but then really engaging critically with what is cisgenderism, which is the ideology that centers cisgender body, minds, and identities as the norm, and all other identities, expressions, and experiences as other. I also differentiate between gender identity, expression, experiences, and roles. Those are all different things. For example, my gender identity is transmasculine, but I still experience a lot of misogyny because I'm often still read as feminine, especially because I'm more of a trans faggot, honestly, so more of a queer masculinity and a feminine masculinity. And because of my trans identity, often that gets read as in certain ways. And so really thinking about that, the language that we use, and not thinking so much of what's outdated or what's not. There are plenty of amazing folks who call themselves transsexual and are very up to date. I wouldn't use the word transsexual as a inclusive word to indicate a certain type of identity. But if somebody uses this for their identity, I have no problem honoring that for their identity. And then using words like chest reconstruction, genital reconstruction, body modification. Those are just some examples of words that are linked to gender and sexuality, to gender. And then there's so much to say about sexuality that I feel like we could talk for the next 5 hours and not cover all those topics. Sorry about that.
Well, we could for sure, but it's good to jump in and start somewhere.
Yes.
And probably not good to totally flood everybody, but hopefully
Exactly.
this feels like a good, really, really good start to me. And on a nice, deep level, you really are very, very skilled at giving the 2-minute answer with depth underneath it. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I try not to just stay surface. Like we got enough of that. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. All right. So thank you again so much for sharing your expertise. both your professional and personal experience with us and giving us some support for the work that we're doing. And everybody who has further questions, it's in my course, just bring them to me. I'm happy to help. And we'll make sure that all of Alex's resources and books and website and contact information and all the things. I mean, maybe you need an AASECT supervisor. Here's one. So yeah, awesome. And it's what a pleasure to spend an hour and a little more with you, Alex, today. Thank you so much.
Likewise, this was so fun. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you. I'll throw those resources your way straight away so that I don't forget. And yeah, I hope that I've given you some answers, even though not all the answers. And it's not so much about, I'll leave you with just one thing. It's not so much about doing the right thing. Remember that one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture is perfectionism, but centering the relationship. And so when in doubt, take a deep breath. And it's even okay to say to your clients, I might say this wrong, or I don't know if this is the right word. And just say the thing that you need to say, or seek consult if you want to know more. So it's okay. You don't have to be perfect. And there is no right answer often, but there are precious relationships we have with each other and with our clients. And I know you'll want to hold them as sacred and important. And that's, I think, what's at the heart of it.
That's so beautiful. Yes, I completely agree. We have only got the language that's available to us. We learned it from somewhere. And so then, so often I'm telling my clients, please correct me. Even if what I'm doing is rephrasing, but I'm changing the words, I'm going to say, I'm going to change the words and a little bit of the meaning. This is a bit of a stretch. You're going to have to tell me if I got it right or not, because I'm trying to expand what's possible for them, but I might miss the mark entirely.
Exactly.
And that's not even about gender, but the same principle applies. And everything that comes out of my mouth, I'm looking for feedback. And the feedback that I'm getting is going to inform the work that I'm doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Alex. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful rest of your day and week. And thank you for your generosity in being here.
Likewise. And stay in touch. Bye, everybody.
Okay, take care, everybody. Thank you for your time. And I'll see you again soon.